Okay. All right. Thank you all for coming. For all of y'all that don't know me, my name is Marty Miller. I'm with Providence Title. And Bill, how are you?
Hey, good.
Good. I've been in the real estate industry for a little over 20 years. So, you know, I know enough to say I don't know. Okay. This is Steve Williams. He's my business partner. He's kind of my guy behind the scenes and helps me out with a lot of title-related issues, underwriting issues, things like that. And then also helps run our office. And so he's a good guy to know because he has over 30 years of title experience in the industry. So he's my go-to person if we ever have an issue or need help with anything. But what we're here for today is Firpta. Does everybody know what Firpta stands for? It stands for Foreign Investment in Real Property Act. Okay? My goal here today is not to make you an expert in Firpta. My goal here today is to make you an expert and say, I can't give you that information. You need to seek advice from a CPA or from a tax attorney that understands Firpta. Okay? It's very important that they understand Firpta because not all CPAs understand Firpta. You know, there's been a myth in the title industry or in the real estate industry, let's say, that if the seller has a social security number, then they're exempt from Firpta. Remember I said myth? It is a myth, right? Because anybody can get a social security number, whether you're a United States citizen or a non-citizen, you can have a social security number. Okay? So having a social security number is part of Firpta, but it is not release them from the liability. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a quick little video, and then we'll get into a few questions that I have in your handout there. We'll go through that, and then I'll open it up for questions and answers afterwards, okay? All right. Let me know if y'all can hear this okay. I'm not the best.
How much do you know about Firpta? Could the following scenario happen to you? You are the listing agent. You list a home for sale, an offer comes in, the sellers accept it, and the closing date is finally here. The sellers have packed their entire house. Everything is loaded in the moving van. You attend the signing at the title company office with your sellers. At the signing, the settlement agent asks the sellers to sign the title company's certification of non-forward status form. Upon review, the sellers state they are unable to sign the certification. The settlement agent then tells them that in order to comply with Firpta, 10% of the sales price must be withheld and remitted to the IRS. Needless to say, the sellers look at you, their listing agent, and ask why you didn't tell them this would be happening. The settlement agent revises the closing statement to reflect the withholding. The sales price is $450,000. The withholding is $45,000, which represents most of their proceeds. The sellers are very upset. On the flip side, let's say you are the selling agent representing the buyer in the same transaction. The buyer already signed their loan documents, but the seller has not yet signed their closing documents. The buyer decides to go to the local coffee shop and wait until the keys are ready. The settlement agent calls you and explains the sellers are foreign, and therefore the buyer must withhold and remit 10% of the gross sales price to the IRS, and the buyer will need to complete a few forms. The settlement agent tells you, the selling agent, this can still be taken care of in closing. All the buyer needs to do is complete IRS Forms 8288 and 8288-A, copies A, B, and C, and remit them to the settlement agent for remittance to the IRS. The forms are available at www.irs.gov. Of course, the settlement agent needs this ASAP in order to close on time. Would you be equipped to assist your buyer? What's the problem? problem with this scenario? The settlement agent automatically assumed the seller did not qualify for any other exception, probably because the settlement agent didn't fully understand Firpta either. Turned out the seller did qualify for another exception. The following year, when the seller went to their CPA to file their tax return, they provided their CPA with a copy of their closing statement and the receipt for the withholding, Form 8288-A, Copy B. The CPA asked them why they did not call him. The seller explained this was all done at the last minute and they did not want to cause a delay in closing. Their CPA told them they were exempt from withholding based on the following. The transferor gives you written notice that no recognition of any gain or loss on the transfer is required because of a non-recognition provision in the Internal Revenue Code or a provision in a U.S. tax treaty. In this circumstance, the seller sued the listing broker and the settlement agent for the loss of interest and financial hardship. Both settled since neither could prove they advised the seller to contact their CPA or an attorney for proper advice. An expensive lesson for both companies. Few real estate professionals or settlement agents have the knowledge to advise a buyer or seller about their options regarding Firpta. So what could have been done to avoid this situation? First, Firpta is not new. The act has been around for a long time, but it is important to have an overall understanding of it in order to protect yourself, your company, and to give full disclosure to your clients of their obligations and options. Firpta is the acronym for the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. The Internal Revenue Code, Section 1445, governs this act. All transfers of an interest in U.S. real property are subject to Firpta withholding. Since Firpta affects all transfers of U.S. real property, most purchase and sale agreements make reference to the buyer's obligation to determine if Firpta withholding applies. Displayed here is some example language.
We'll go over that in a second.
There are a total of 10 exceptions to Firpta withholding. None of them were automatic. In every transfer, the buyer must determine if an exception applies, or they must withhold 10% of the gross sales price. All the exceptions are described on the forms and publications posted to the IRS website at www.irs.gov. IRS Publication 515 provides a detailed explanation of withholding and whose obligation Firpta withholding is. Publication 515 contains several important definitions. Click each of the topics to learn more.
Well, you have those in your handout, but the most important thing I want to point out right here is this word right here, buyer. Okay? This is the key to Firpta and understanding really the greatest thing that you can walk away today is whose responsibility is Firpta. It's the buyer's responsibility. They are the only ones responsible. Not you, not the title company, not the lender, not the listing agent. It is the buyer. Firpta is not a requirement of title insurance. It is not a requirement of the title company. Okay? It is the buyer's sole responsibility to determine whether if Firpta applies or does not apply. Okay? And we'll get into more detail about that in a second.
The transferor does not have to withhold if any of these exceptions apply. Click each of the numbers to learn more.
We'll go over those.
Having an in-depth understanding of how each of these exceptions could apply requires a comprehensive knowledge of many different tax laws. For many years, some title companies would, at the closing table, have the seller sign the title company's Certification of Non-Foreign Status form. The certification was put together based on only one of the 10 exceptions, which says the transferor gives you, meaning the buyer, a certification stating under penalties of perjury that the transferor is not a foreign person and containing the transferor's name, U.S. taxpayer identification number, and home address, or office address in the case of an entity. A certification based on this exception may look something like this.
Okay, it's very important to remember here. This is a notification from the seller to the buyer. Okay? And I'm going to go into detail about this because it's changed a little bit since this video was done. And so I'm going to go into detail about this as well.
Now, there were several issues with this procedure. Number one, the certification was presented in a manner which implied the buyer would have to withhold 10% from the seller's proceeds unless the seller was able to complete and sign the form. It did not recognize any of the other 9 exceptions as being possible. 2, if the seller was unable to sign the certification, neither the buyer nor the seller were prepared to determine if another more complex exception applied, nor were they equipped to complete the proper IRS forms for remittance, which caused a delay in closing. Number 3, because the principals were rushed, mistakes occurred, causing penalties, interest, and tax levies against the buyer. And last, number 4, if there were not enough sale proceeds, the seller either had to come in with funds to close or default on the contract.
So, Marty, let me ask you about that before you
Under
go
the
on.
Act, it is the buyer's obligation to withhold. Why?
Is that a situation where there's not 10% equity, that if they're not walking away, if they wouldn't walk away with 10%,
That's correct.
then they're going to have to bring money to table?
That's correct.
Okay, all right. Just wanna make
That's
sure
correct.
understood.
Yep.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
You're saying it's the buyer's responsibility. So you're saying the buyer of this foreign national owned property, or when that foreign national buys the property? and
No,
the buyer-
that's a great question. Let me clarify that. You have a seller that is a foreign national, okay, or a non-resident alien, okay. And I know it's kind of weird, but that's how the IRS classifies it: resident alien, non-resident alien, okay. Because you can be a foreign national and be a resident alien, right? You can be a foreign national and be a non-resident alien, okay? So the IRS views it as a non-resident alien or resident alien, all right? But the answer to your question is you have a seller that is a foreign person, okay? That new buyer that's buying that property, it's their responsibility to determine if Firpta applies for that transaction.
So that's why the agents better know.
That's right. And we'll get into
Regardless of which side you're representing.
that's right. So we'll,
And so if I have the buyer and I have no clue who the seller is,
that's right.
I'm supposed to ask.
Yes, and I'll show you why and how you can obtain that without being PC, let's say, politically correct. Because, you know, people do get offended in today's society, and you ask, are you a United States citizen? Whatever it may be, right? So you've got to have a little couth, but there is a way you can do that, and I'll show you how. So, yes.
It seems, my experience with working with foreign nationals is they're usually very savvy and know about this.
They do.
But there is nowhere in our paperwork where it asks them that. Ever recall them.
Yeah, I'll show you where it's at. It's there.
When they buy a house here as a foreign national, I've never been aware that this is something that says, now, when you go to sell this, bear this in mind.
Right. Okay. You know, and there's if you're representing a foreign national as a buyer and they're getting ready to buy, there is a way that they can purchase the property to where they can make sure that Firpta is not going to apply when they sell the property. Okay? But they will need a CPA or tax attorney's help on that, because there's certain steps that they have to go through. There's certain regulations that they have to do. But a buyer can buy a property in a manner that would reduce or eliminate Firpta in the future for them. Okay? And I'll show you on that as well. Okay, we're going to hit play here. This is almost over, and then we'll get into the
Foreigner
nuts.
sells their property and leaves the U.S., there is no guarantee they will file an appropriate tax return for the gain on the sale. Therefore, withholding is required to be collected at closing as a prepayment, and the buyer can be penalized for not ensuring it is done. The IRS ensures payment by naming the buyer as the withholding agent, since the IRS has the power to lien the buyer's new property for non-payment. Based on the examples, buyers should determine the seller's status much earlier on in the transaction. If a seller is foreign, the seller should also be familiar with the exceptions in order to make the best decision when accepting an offer. Since the purchase and sale agreement typically states the buyer and seller have agreed to provide the needed documents, buyers should ask the seller to provide a form of certification as to their non-foreign status at the same time the purchase and sale agreement is accepted. If this exception does not apply, the buyer and seller will still have plenty of time to investigate the other exceptions and determine if another applies. This would eliminate last-minute surprises, which could cause an entire deal to unfold. As discussed, there are 9 other exceptions. A seller's inability to sign a non-foreign certification does not automatically mean withholding applies. Buyers and sellers should seek competent legal and/or tax advice to ensure compliance with this regulation. There are many events throughout the purchase of real estate which require that the buyer perform their due diligence. Real estate agents regularly notify the principals of their responsibility with disclosures and waivers for items an agent is not qualified to do. For example, a home inspection. To assist your buyers, you can provide them with a sample certification of non-foreign status. Suggest to your buyer they require the seller to complete it at the time the purchase and sale agreement is executed, if applicable. Additionally, you may want to have the buyer sign a disclosure and waiver of real estate agent responsibility form. Here is a sample of the waiver being used by the F&F family of companies. Your broker may choose to revise it and use as a notification to your clients and protect the brokerage. If the first scenario wasn't enough to convince you why it is important for buyers to determine the seller's status at the time the sellers accept their offer to purchase, we will go over a few more examples. At the closing table, the settlement agent presents the certification of
Oops, hold
non-foreign
on.
status. The seller tells the settlement agent.
There we go. Missed
As
one.
discussed earlier, there are a total of 10 exceptions to Firpta withholding. 3 of these exceptions apply in most situations. One of the exceptions to withholding is you, the transferee, acquire the property for use as a residence, and the amount realized, the sales price, is not more than $300,000. You or a member of your family must have definite plans to reside at the property for at least 50% of the number of days the property is used by any person during each of the first 2 12-month periods following the date of transfer. When counting the number of days the property is used, do not count the days the property will be vacant. For this exception, the transferee must be an individual. Here's the scenario. You list a home for $275,000. The seller is foreign. You receive 2 full-price offers. In the first offer, the buyer is paying cash and will use the property as a rental. In the second, the buyers are parents purchasing the property for their daughter to live in while she attends college. They will be getting a new loan to purchase the property. Which offer should the seller accept? Good question. Under most circumstances, the seller would accept the cash purchaser, since the closing will most likely occur quicker and is not contingent upon the buyer obtaining a new loan. Upon your urging, the seller accepts the cash offer from the investor. At the closing table, the settlement agent presents the certification of non-foreign status. The seller tells the settlement agent he cannot sign the form since he is foreign. The settlement agent at the closing table tells the seller she is going to have to withhold $27,500 and remit it to the IRS. Had the seller accepted the other offer, he would not have been subject to withholding. In that situation, the other buyers were purchasing the property for less than $300,000 and a family member was going to occupy the property. What if the seller found out the buyers on the other offer would have made the transaction exempt from withholding? not even explain this to him or advise him to seek financial advice. Now the seller very well may have recourse against the brokerage. The purchase price is $500,000. The seller is foreign. At the closing table, the settlement agent finds out the seller is foreign. No one had discovered this earlier. The buyers are sitting outside their new house in their moving van with no access to the internet. The settlement agent notifies the selling agent the seller is foreign, who helps the buyer and seller determine what forms need to be completed and remitted to the IRS. What if the seller does not have a U.S. taxpayer identification number? Do you know the answers? This is just another reason why it is so important for the buyer and seller to determine the seller's status early on in the transaction, rather than wait until the day of closing.
Last one.
The sale is a short sale for $430,000. You and the seller work with the seller's lender to obtain short sale approval. After 6 long months, the lender finally approves the sale. At the closing, the settlement agent asks the seller to sign their certification of non-foreign status form. The seller says he is unable to sign the certification since he is Canadian. Keep in mind, the withholding is due on the gross sales price, not the proceeds. And do you think the short sale lender will be willing to approve the withholding payment of $43,000 to the IRS? Probably not. This illustrates yet another reason Firpta withholding should be included as a part of the initial negotiation. One of the 10 exceptions to withholding is the seller has a withholding certificate. A withholding certificate is issued in response to an application for a waiver or reduction of the withholding. The application illustrates to the IRS there will be no gain on the sale, which means the seller will have no tax liability. Sellers cannot apply for a withholding certificate until they have entered into a purchase and sale agreement. In a short sale, it usually takes months for the lender to approve the short sale, right? It also takes the IRS 90 days to respond to an application for a waiver or reduction of the withholding. Rather than waiting until the day of closing, in this scenario, the seller could have made their application at the time they accepted the buyer's offer. As long as they provided all the appropriate backup documentation, the seller would most likely have the withholding certificate at closing. Instead of the deal blowing up at the closing table, it can close and the buyer can meet their requirements under Firpta.
Okay, I'm going to pause here a second. Like I said a few minutes ago, some processes have changed since this was produced. And when was it, Steve?
This is 2010.
2010, okay. This keeps referring back to a certificate for non-foreign status, that the title company would provide that. All title companies have, or at least our title company, we have gone away from that, okay? The reason for that is because title companies were providing that, and the buyer and the seller were relying on that document to be proof that the Firpta did not apply, okay? But what's coming up, though, give you a scenario, and this was a recent lawsuit. The seller signed it and lied on it, moved out of the country, and sure enough, at the end of the year, the buyer gets a tax bill. They send this form, the certificate of non-reporting, to the IRS saying, I've got an affidavit here from the seller saying that they were a resident alien. IRS says, I don't care about that form. Here's your tax bill. The only certificate that the IRS will accept is this one right here that they're talking about, the withholding certificate. Okay? That is the only one the IRS will back, is if the seller has the certificate for non-withholding from the IRS. That's the only one that they will 100% guarantee. The other only 100% way is the buyer withholds the 10% and sends it into the IRS. Those are the two 100% guarantees, okay, that you have to remember. That's it. The other thing in here, it kept saying, have them seek legal advice. Have them seek an attorney's opinion. Have them seek a CPA's opinion. I'm not a licensed attorney. I'm not a licensed CPA. Okay? I'm not going to give you help on determining what forms to use, what forms not to use, how to fill the forms out. I have a good understanding of this, but I'll keep it kind of to myself. The only thing that I would recommend is that you advise them and you document that you've advised them to seek professional help. Okay? Going back to your earlier question, how do we ask the seller? If you turn to the last page in your handout, it's just a copy of a blank contract. It's page 7 of a contract. If you look at number 20, most people don't even read number 20, but in every contract that you have done, you are supposed to get the certification from the seller. It states it right here.
Marty, may I say something?
Mm-hmm.
We just went through this, we haven't closed yet. The listing agent knew that the sellers were in Dubai, were with oil and gas, but they owned a home here for a long time. As soon as she found out, we entered into all of what Marty's talking about. And I will tell you that this particular buyer was like, oh my God, why am I doing all this when the seller owns the house? And that's, you know, when you talked about the buyer thing, it is scary to the buyer because he's got all of this paperwork. And we were closing with that. And so Christine and Stephen and I made the calls, and she got on it right away. We got on it right away. But the amount of paperwork that the buyer is responsible for signing, but we insisted that he go to a CPA. Even if we had to pay for it, it was $250, okay? And so that's what this buyer is going to do. He wants the house. Once it was explained to him, he was okay, but boy, how much was old? I don't know. Stephen's handling most of the deal, and I didn't see all the paperwork. But when he made that call, it was frightening to the buyer. So that's another thing we've got to live with. We've got to be able to explain to the buyer the true reason for it, and please do what we're asking. At first, they weren't going to go to a CPA, and you know, I said we don't want to take responsibility for this paperwork not being filled out correctly. If it goes to CPA, it will be filled out correctly.
Yeah.
And 5 years ago, I went to a closing where this came up when we didn't know anything about it. We started the closing and it was stopped.
Yeah.
Because the seller did not, he was a foreign national, he did not get any social security, get nothing. And we just happened to be a fee for lawyer title company, so the lawyer took care of everything, and we closed about 5 hours later. That was the first time I'd ever run into it, and that's just the first time in 5 years.
The big thing is that you've got, if in our marketplace, we have a lot of foreign people, right? I'll come back, hold on one second. We have a lot of foreign people. They can be Canadian, they can be whatever it may be. Understanding Firpta completely is a nightmare. 62 pages on Firpta. These are just on the examples. There's 62 pages here explaining what the examples or exemptions of Firpta are. 10 pages, or 62 pages, okay, of the 10. In here, though, there are sub-references to other tax codes that apply or could apply. So if you printed everything, it would probably be 4 times as thick as this. So finding a CPA that understands Firpta and finding a tax attorney that understands Firpta that you can have on your team is very important. I closed a transaction 3 weeks ago. It was a tough transaction. Seller was foreign, buyer was buying the property. Buyer told the seller in the beginning, the price was under $300,000. Buyer told the seller in the beginning that they were going to be living in the property. Okay? I get closing instructions the night before to work up the closing statement. I notice on the deed that this is there's a 1 to 4 family rider attached to the deed. 1 to 4 family rider in your documents, closing documents, is whether it's a second home or an investment property. Therefore, automatically, what was one of the exemptions, it could apply, could not apply. At that point, I saw the red flag, so I let the agents know. But it was a nightmare. It was probably the longest closing I had. It was about 8-9 hours all day. The reason I bring up a qualified CPA and tax attorney, seller hired a CPA. CPA came into the closing room and said, Firpta does not apply because you have a social security number. So we asked him, well, or the other agent said, okay, if you're saying Firpta doesn't apply, the buyer's agent said, if you're saying it doesn't apply, will you put that in writing? The CPA said, oh, well, it's going to take me 3 or 4 weeks. He didn't understand Firpta.
It was a very long closing. The sellers didn't want to do the withholding naturally. They walked out of the office, they walked down the hall, and they hired a CPA. And they had the CPA come in and was representing without being a representative for the seller, trying to get the buyer to understand. The buyer stood firm and said, put it in writing. And at that point, this gentleman wanted to exit the stage door right.
Yeah, we
So
called
all
a couple of
CPAs,
and they
all
didn't understand it.
CPAs
Yeah.
are not what you need. You need somebody educated in Firpta itself. We only have one name that we refer,
That's what we
and
want to
the person was so busy during the tax season that he couldn't return calls very quickly. But it's important that not just be a CPA, it's somebody that understands Firpta, and a legal counsel the same way.
Who do you recommend?
His name is David Matos, and if you send me an email, I'll be happy to send you his contact information. He's very good, but he's very overwhelmed, and his position is that, you know, a lot of people ask him a lot of questions, right? But he is in the business, obviously, to support his family. So if you want his response, if you want his time, I have found that you're going to have to go ahead and get under contract with him, and he's faster to respond back to you, okay?
When we called the first lawyer, in fact, my lawyer is also a CPA, Dale said, can't do it, I have never done anything with it, I don't understand it, you don't want to hire me, I'd be happy to help you with it. So that was when I realized the point is true.
So getting back, is it a title company's responsibility to determine whether Firpta applies? No. Do us, as me as the title company, do I care whether Firpta gets withheld or not? No. Okay, because we can close and insure the transaction without withholding the 10%. Okay, that's why title companies have gotten away from that certificate of non-foreign status. Okay, what we do have at the title company, what they will be signing is a Firpta waiver. Okay, both the buyer and seller sign that, and that's just a waiver of the title company's responsibility. Okay, like the video said, it might be a good idea for you all to have a waiver of some sort.
Marty, can I add something?
Yeah.
If your title companies, a lot of agents would like to go, they just say they want to go to the other agent or another title company, rather. And they go to the other title company who may or may not understand everything that's written here, 63 pages of instructions for just one form. And they'll recite whatever they can. The person's got a social security number. And Marty and I are posing is why would you want to take our advice when we're going to ask you, the buyers to sign a waiver and the seller to sign a waiver? Is our greatest goal in this is to try to get you to say less on an area that is very difficult to understand and protect you. In his 8-hour closing, we feared for our agents in that closing. Irregardless of who represented who, since both are paid a commission from the seller or the listing agent and split that commission, a buyer would sue both of you, depending on what was said. Marty, in brilliance, exited the room a lot. We let leave him there to say whatever. It served us no purpose. We tried, we couldn't get him to stop talking, and one was very strong, trying to represent the seller, so they didn't want to see the seller have to withhold this 10%, and they just did their natural agent role. And saying this is man, we were fearful for our agents. You got to say less. you gotta put them out there to the professionals, you gotta back off, and don't try to handle the spot for them.
You had a question?
Why isn't this handled at the listing? It seems like way past time.
The reason it's not handled at the listing is just like just a few moments ago. Most people have never read paragraph 20. They don't know that it's a requirement, right? But if you look at paragraph 20, it's not a requirement of the seller to initiate it. It's the last page of the...
The seller cannot apply for it until they have a written contract.
Okay, that is a great question. When this video came out, there was an understanding that the seller could not apply for the certificate prior to being under contract. Okay, that has changed. The seller can apply for it prior to being under contract, but you have to remember it takes 90 days. The IRS has up to 90 days to respond back to it. Now, in order to apply for it, I don't know what the form to use. They would have to go to a CPA, and I'd recommend that the CPA fill it out correctly and send it in. Because any delay, it's not that they will receive it back, it's just the IRS has up to 90 days to respond. And so the IRS could view it and say, well, we need this, we need that. And it could be a long time. Yes?
Better yet, when a foreign national is buying property in a foreign country where our country, obviously, we have these two rules, why isn't it handled then? And that's what I find most foreign nationals are very well versed in what their problems are.
Yeah, a lot of them...
Or so they think.
Right,
I don't.
right. A lot of them, I am seeing some buy the property in a different manner. But I am also seeing a lot of foreign buyers just go through the normal process that everybody else goes through. Okay? Can they, like I said earlier, can they buy it in a manner where they would be exempt? Yes. But they are going to need help on that because